Awesome. So we are going to give it just a few seconds for all of our attendees to tune in. We had quite a bit of folks that signed up for this evening, so thank you so much for joining us. Also, we are live on Facebook for those that weren't able to register, but we'll get started in just 1 second. And again, thank you all. I know 6 o'clock is an interesting hour to have such an important conversation, but as you can imagine, the evening before session starts is a little booked, but thank you for spending your time with us this evening. Let's see. Awesome. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And I just want to say again, thank you so much for spending some time with us this evening. I am Delegate Sia Price, and I represent the 95th House District, and that is mostly in the city of Newport News, but with a small part of Hampton. This evening, we are discussing voting rights and the ways that we plan to move forward in Virginia to make sure that voter suppression, discrimination, and intimidation are a part of our past and not a part of our future here in the Commonwealth. Tonight, I have with me some heavy hitters, like period. And you'll learn more about them. But before we jump in, I do want to say one thing. There have been some significant events in the last 30 days that have shown us that we must, and I mean absolutely must, protect our democracy. And we should all celebrate when more people participate in our democracy than less. So we celebrate the historic turnout in the November elections and the unprecedented turnout in Georgia for the runoff elections. And then we take a moment to acknowledge the very act of voting and the practice of fighting to protect voting rights, or even voter registration, can be dangerous because of things like what we saw last week. And we know that the ability for everyone to vote enrages some, and it enrages those that need to cheat to win. But we're not going to focus on them. We're going to focus on what are we doing right here in our Commonwealth moving forward to protect our democracy and to protect our voting rights for those that have been targeted for years and years and years, and we can really move this forward. So tonight I have some folks with me who I'm trying not to fangirl too much, but if you've been paying attention to civil rights, if you've been paying attention to voting rights litigation, and just some of the heavy hitters in the movement, we have them here representing their organizations and the work that they've been doing. So first, I'm going to kick it to Marcia Johnson-Blanco. And so tonight I'm going to go by Sia, and she's going to go by Marcia, so there's no confusion. But Marcia, please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Delegate Price, for inviting me to join you this evening. And I know I'm always in good company when I'm with Judith and Tram. I'm Marcia Johnson-Blanco, and I co-direct the Voting Rights Project of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And for the past 16 years, have really been working to ensure that all have access to the ballot, but particularly people of color. And so I've been doing that through ensuring the full protections of the Voting Rights Act are going to be enforced and be reconstituted. I'll talk a bit more about that later, through the convening of election protection, which provides resources to voters and help to voters, and then through using international mechanisms like our treaty obligations to really highlight the horrible impact of our felony disfranchisement laws on minority voters. And so I'll talk a bit more about that later today, and just look forward to having this great conversation. Thanks again for having me.
Awesome, thank you. And next, Tram Nguyen with New Virginia Majority, if you'll introduce yourself.
Hey, y'all. I'll echo what both Delegate Price and Marcia have already said. Is anytime I get to be on a panel with these lovely ladies is like a joy and a privilege. So thank you for inviting me, Delegate Price. As she mentioned, I'm the co-director of New Virginia Majority. We are a state-based, statewide organization that promotes, voting and promotes civic participation, engagement among communities of color, folks that have typically been on the sidelines or marginalized, and encouraging us to use our voice and our power, not only at the ballot box, but after November or whenever the election might happen to be, to hold our elected officials accountable. And so over the last 13 years, not only have we made significant gains on democracy, but also on civil rights and immigration rights and housing and education. I mean, it's we are for the people, and we want to make sure that our government reflects the very people that it aims to represent. And just to note about what Delegate Price started the conversation, noting about the challenges that we are facing right now. Like, let's be real about what we have seen. And I think we all know what we are facing, and it's not new to many of us. And I think if anything, it emphasizes and reemphasizes for me the importance of really protecting our institutions of democracy. It's what this country was founded on, and we need to protect it as much as possible. And where we go from here matters and depends on what we do in this moment. And so really appreciate folks taking the time to really talk about voting rights and how we can protect these institutions of democracy, because this is what our country, we depend on it. So thanks for joining us tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Tram. And last but not least, we have Judith Browne Dianis. If you can introduce yourself.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Delegate Price, thanks for having me. When Tram connected us, and if Tram says I should do something, I'm going to do it, because I'm a big follower of hers, and have been with Marcia. That folks should know she didn't really dig into how great what she does is, and election protection, just so you know, is the major hotline across the country that really is where we get to all come together to troubleshoot to end voter suppression. So she didn't really honk her horn as much as she should have. But anyway, so I am Judith Browne Dianis. I'm Executive Director of the National Office of Advancement Project. We are a national racial justice organization that works with grassroots organizations to eliminate structural racism. I am a litigator by training and by practice, and have done voting rights litigation dating back to the 90s, and was counsel in the case NAACP versus Katherine Harris in Florida. And my organization has a deep connection to Virginia. In 2003, we kicked off our first campaign around rights restoration in the state of Virginia, and since then have teamed up with New Virginia Majority to continue to push that work. We also, in 2008, I sued the state of Virginia because we knew that turnout for that election, where a Black man was running for president, was going to mean that we couldn't have people waiting in line. And so we ended up suing the state of Virginia because we found that there were disparities in the allocation of voting machines and poll workers that would have led to really long lines. And so, so we have a deep connection and continue to support the work of New Virginia Majority and others in the state. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation tonight.
Awesome, thank you. And then she hopped off camera, but also in the room is Tempest Boone, my Chief of Staff. Yay, hey. Who's going to be monitoring any questions that you have here in the webinar. You can click on the Q&A function, or if you are watching on Facebook, you can ask your question in the comments, but we are going to have significant time for your questions. And then in a few moments, we will also be joined by one of the chief co-patrons of House Bill 1890, which is the Voting Rights Act of Virginia that we've introduced, Delegate LaSharice Aird. Our other chief co-patron at this time is Delegate Ward, and then we have one more coming that we'll announce as soon as that's official. But before we get to the meat of the conversation, I do want to go over just a few things that you all have said when you answered your registration questions, and that was Basically, 3 questions. One was, what went well for you while voting in the November 2020 elections? And so everyone that answered that question answered either the ease of voting or early voting or being able to vote by mail. But it was just the fact that you had so many options and that voting was easier this year than I think it's ever been since I've been voting. And I know, we fought for those. So just my point here is not that voting just mysteriously became easier. It is the work of folks like that are on our call that are suing, the pants off of some of the obstacles that have been put in place, like voter ID law. But it's also the work of those like New Virginia Majority that have been advocating for new policies for more than 10 years. So everyone knows that there was a shift in power and the Democrats took over in 2020. And that is when you saw a lot of those provisions coming into place. So then the number one question I received was, will those provisions be made permanent? And there is a bill that we're trying to make a lot of those provisions permanent, but the no excuse absentee voting and the 45 days of early voting are already law here in Virginia. That was not just because of COVID. And so we'll make sure that in the follow-up email, you get a lot of information about the voting laws that were passed in regular session 2020 and the ones that are coming up in 2021 that we need your help fighting for. The other question was, what would you like to see next in voting rights? And so a lot of folks answered about the ease of wanting to kind of keep going with how easy it is to vote in Virginia. But one of the things that was pointed out here is voting rights not being taken away because of someone being convicted of a felony. And that conversation as to whether or not we'll have automatic restoration or we'll have a constitutional amendment change so that everyone, as soon as you turn 18, you get the right to vote and it's unrevocable, like if that's going to be the policy decision that we go for. That is a huge conversation that is coming to the General Assembly starting tomorrow. So that is super, super exciting when we're talking about easing the access to the ballot box. But another thing was clear and consistent information and visible. So we'll get into that when we talk about the bill a little later, but like the voters need to know the information that they need in order to be able to use the tools that have been made legally available for them. And then last but not least, you all were asked, what would you change about the voting process that you went through in November 2020? There were quite a few partisan answers to this. And so we can skip that, but just for the general part of it was more voter education, more polling places, especially for the early vote. There were some areas in our state that had long lines. And then there were several answers about being safe as they go about voting. As we know, in Virginia, we had folks with weapons that showed up in polling places, and we'll have some legislation that will deal with that from other patrons as well. So that's the general gist of what you all answered about your experience. And we've been listening to people since the May elections of last year, and moving forward, we've been listening to people and their experiences from the November elections and the January elections. And Marcia heard lots as they run that election protection hotline, because that's who you call when there's an issue. And we used a lot of that information in order to craft the legislation that we're moving forward with this year. But now I just want to transition just a little bit into talking more about specifically voting rights. Why are they important? What are they? Why are we fighting so hard to protect them? And what are some of the challenges that we have coming up? And then we'll get into that, where we're moving forward. So Marcia, I would love for you, still so weird, sorry. But Marcia, I would love for you to move forward and tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing, voting rights, why it's so important for us to fight to protect them.
Thank you. And I'm going to kick off this discussion from where Tram was talking about, what type of democracy are we? And a lot of what we witnessed last week was the continued struggle to become a full democracy. When this country was first started, the only people who were allowed to vote were white men with property. And we have been pushing forth to ensure that all people can vote from that point. And at every step, there's been a backlash. And what we saw last Wednesday is indicative of a time where there's a backlash and where our country's at a crossroads. And how do we move forward from this crossroads? So, the last big crossroads that we had that really helped us to advance voting rights was the Civil War. After the Civil War, we saw what's called the Civil War amendments. First, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, and then the 14th Amendment, which among other things gave citizenship rights to those who were formerly enslaved. And then the 15th Amendment that said you can't discriminate on the right to vote because of race or ethnicity. And those were in the 1800s, in the 1860s, 1870, when the 15th Amendment was passed. But it wasn't until 55 years ago, with the enactment of the Voting Rights Act, that we actually had a full democracy. So in essence, American democracy is very, very young. And we have been fighting since 1965 to really build on and fulfill the promise of the Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act essentially systematically struck down the barriers to the vote that had been in place, even though we have these constitutional amendments and constitutional rights to the vote. And the Supreme Court, around the time of the passage of the Voting Rights Act, said the right to vote is preservative of all other rights. And in a democracy, if without having the right to vote, we have no other rights, we have no other means to address all the issues and all the policies that we care about. And one of the big things that the Voting Rights Act did was that it required jurisdictions with a history of discrimination in voting to submit any voting change to the federal government for review and to show that it wasn't discriminatory before it could be enacted. However, after decades of success, in 2013, the Supreme Court in the Shelby County versus Holder decision struck at the heart of the Voting Rights Act and struck down the formula that determined which jurisdictions had to submit voting changes. And I should say that Virginia was one of those jurisdictions that had to submit their voting changes before they could be implemented. And the Supreme Court did this despite Congress reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act with a very extensive record showing that discrimination in voting continued to exist. And I know Judith is going to talk more about, specifically what that discrimination looks like. And the court, even in its opinion, as I said, it acknowledged that discrimination exists even while it was ignoring the congressional record. And the late, great Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a very iconic quote in her dissent to the Shelby County decision, where she said, throwing out the Voting Rights Act when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. Another significant law that was passed in addition to the Voting Rights Act was the National Voter Registration Act. And this was passed in 1993. Again, just showing you how recent these advancements in our voting rights has been. And this ensured that there was more access to voter registration. And also since the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the National Voter Registration Act, we've seen this push back against opportunities to register to vote. And as recently as 2018, the Supreme Court says that states or jurisdictions could start removing people from voter registration rolls for not voting, not having voted in previous elections, even though the National Voter Registration Act explicitly says you can't do that. And so, bills, as was mentioned, being able to automatically register to vote and to advance our opportunities to register to vote are really, really important. I mean, essentially, where we are right now is we're in that, rainstorm that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg talked about, where we're confronting and having to combat voter suppression. But what we've seen since this last election is that push to fight voter suppression is being undermined by a rhetoric of voter fraud. And we're going to see as we move forward, having to fight back against this false narrative of voter fraud. I will say here, there's no significant voter fraud. And when voter fraud does happen, it's usually by candidates and institutions, not the voters. And yet voters are being punished for based on a myth. And this is something that we're really going to need to push back against as we move forward from this election. We are also going to be moving into a redistricting cycle for the first time in decades without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. And so what this means is that citizens are really going to have to engage more than they have before in the process, building a record of showing what they want to ensure that their rights are not going to be undermined. We're also going to have to push back against efforts to put up barriers to the laws that made it possible to vote safely in a pandemic. And it was mentioned about no excuse voting in Virginia and expansion of early voting, but there are efforts in other states, and we have to be vigilant that these efforts also don't come up in Virginia to push back against the very laws and processes that made it possible for people to be able to vote safely. As I mentioned with redistricting, we need to ensure that voters are engaged in that process and to make sure that the districts that are drawn ensure that racial and ethnic minorities have an opportunity to elect their candidates of choice. And we also need to fight to ensure the passage of both a federal Voting Rights Act and also a state Voting Rights Act, because as we've seen, as we saw, we are in the midst of a backlash against ensuring that all eligible voters have a voice in our democracy, and that even when they're voted, that those votes are accepted, not delegitimatized, and that they're not seen as being illegitimate in some way. And so we really need to ensure that this legacy of building on the foundation of our Constitution and laws such as the Voting Rights Act are ones that we can make sure move forward and that we don't move back. So, I started by saying that the right to vote is preservative of all other rights. And we really need to look at that as the foundation on which we build anything we want to do. All the issues that we care about, we want to make sure that that the right to vote is sacrosanct, because without it, we can't move forward as a society. We can't become a fully functioning democracy unless we ensure that all eligible voters have the right to vote. And so I will stop there and look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you so much. Getting a better understanding of what voting rights are, why they're important, why we need to protect them, and a little bit of the history behind some of the games that have been played. So now I'm going to turn to you, Judith, and see what are some of the challenges that you've seen over the years that have threatened voting rights? And then what does this current political climate really tell us about the need to protect our voting rights?
Sure. So thanks again for having me. So I want to start with the moment that we're in because it's the context for everything. So the moment that we are in, we have seen before. It may feel very different, but we've seen it before. We are in a moment where we had record numbers of people turn out to vote, and record numbers of people of color in particular who turned out to vote. And typically when we see an expansion of our democracy, what we see is a backlash on the other side of it. Because as Marcia started out with, the people who held the right to vote when this country first started were white men with property. As we have seen that extended to other people, including people of color, we have seen those who had it originally trying to fight back against that. And so as we see the browning of America, the rising majority of people of color and people who are progressive moving towards the polls and stepping into their power, what we always see are those who say, wait a second, that's actually not who we are, and we want our power back, right? We want to make America great again. And so, that's what we have seen in this past week, is this fight over the franchise and who gets to have the political power in this country. And so I say we've seen this before because, you know, when I look at what happened in the election of Barack Obama, President Obama in 2008, what we saw right after that wasn't necessarily people showing up to the Capitol to commit sedition. But what we did see was that states moved very quickly after he was elected to actually restrict the right to vote. And that was because they'd seen these record numbers of people turning out. And so voter suppression has always existed because it is a way to restrict who gets access to the ballot. And it's changed its tools over a period of time. So yes, we don't have poll taxes, and well, some would say we still do in Florida, but we don't have poll taxes and we don't have literacy tests like we did before the Voting Rights Act. But what we had after 2008 was voter ID laws that were passed. I mean, states started to pick up very quickly to restrict the vote by using voter ID laws because they knew that the restrictive laws that they were putting in place, as one court said, were surgically crafted to disenfranchise Black people and people of color. What we saw were cuts to early voting. What we saw were purges, right? Purges have been used as, while some might say, oh, this is how we make sure that our books don't have dead people on them. Aggressive purges have been used to keep people off because they know that communities of color move more often, are more transient. And so, so they are the first people to come off. After the 2000 election, we saw a really bad purge by the state of Florida in that 2000 election that led to the disenfranchisement of African Americans in particular. The other tools that we see are things that seem like they might be innocuous, not a big deal, but the moving of a polling place. We saw thousands and thousands of polling places being moved in this election and in prior elections, so that when our communities turn out to vote, they, you know, if I've been voting at the same place for 20 years and I go there and now it's gone, maybe I won't do the extra work to figure out where I'm supposed to go. The other point is that when we move polling places, they may be moved farther away from communities, just making it harder for people to go to those polling places. The cutbacks to early voting, the cutbacks to Sunday voting in some states are the kinds of things and tools that have been used to make it harder to vote. And so this is the challenge for us now, because this past election, we voted in the midst of a pandemic. We've never had to do that before. And what we saw was in a lot of states, we had to fight. Organizations like Advancement Project and the Lawyers Committee had to fight to get things like access to mail-in ballots, to get drop-off boxes that just made sense in the midst of a pandemic. And by the way, they didn't make sense in the midst of a pandemic. They actually just make sense, right? Like just generally, there is this fight about, should we make voting easier for people? And what we do know, and the state of Virginia shows us, and the state of Michigan shows us, is that when we make voting easier, people actually go out and vote in record numbers. And so there are a lot of people who don't like that idea. And so what we will see in states after this election is a move to restrict mail-in ballots. And as Marcia said, you know, voter fraud does really not exist. You're more likely to be struck by lightning than to find a prosecutable case of voter fraud. And so this is the narrative that we are up against. And I just want to say one last thing is that, you know, the big problem that we have in this country is that when there was a compromise that led to the Constitution and led to the end of the Confederacy, part of the compromise was that we wouldn't have an explicit right to vote in our Constitution, in the United States Constitution. And that what we would do instead is leave it to all of the states to decide how we would vote. And so that means that states get to decide, and election officials. We should not, you know, leave local election officials out of this, because we have over 13,000 election jurisdictions that run elections over 13,000 different ways. And so I just want to say to you, Delegate Price, that what you are moving in the state of Virginia in terms of a voting rights bill is important, because while we may think Virginia has done a great job because of all the work that you all have put in to get voting changed dramatically, we saw that in North Carolina too. And in North Carolina, they started to go backwards. And so the ability to have the tools that we need to make sure that voters are protected, that those who have political desires or the desire to discriminate are not able to do that is important. So I applaud your efforts. This is the kind of thing that we need in this moment, because we know that there are people who do not want all of us to participate. And our democracy depends on having all of our voices as part of the process. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And so, you know, we're gonna keep it moving. Y'all can see why this webinar was so important. But thank you, Judith and Marcia, for bringing up those points. And y'all do work across the nation. So, you know, we may not have the same issues that Georgia have. We may not have signature match. We may not have the purges as maybe known, but we have our own issues. And so, Tram, I want to know from you, because your work is specific here in just Virginia, and like, well, and then you lend your help to other places too, but mostly you're here right in Virginia. So what can we do at the state level to protect Virginia voters? What can we continue to do? And what is the current political climate tell us about the need for something like the Voting Rights Act of Virginia?
Thanks. Yeah, that following Judith is just, I mean, you just like drop the mic and it's really hard to follow, but I will try. I will try and maybe just, and thank you, Delegate Price, for giving me that lifeline to be able to just focus on Virginia, because I can do that. I can definitely do that for her. Yeah, I would say, you know, a lot of the things that were mentioned in terms of making it harder for Virginians or for voters anywhere to cast their ballot, we have seen here, right? So the voter purges that were mentioned, I'll remind folks that in 2013, you know, there was a voter purge that happened literally within like 60 days of that November 2013 election. And I remember that was such a big deal, because we were like, where did this come from? And Larry Hakey, the Chesterfield County Registrar, refused to actually purge voters from the list that the state gave him, because he said, this list is really inaccurate. I know these voters exist, and I know that they are registered to vote in Chesterfield County. So I say all of those things because I think Virginia has come a long way. I think in October, there was a report that was issued that ranks all 50 states in terms of ease of voting. And in 1 year, y'all, with all of the I know 2020 was an awful year, and we all want to forget that let's forget it and let's pretend it didn't exist. But before we let all of the negative stuff that happened in 2020 to overshadow, I want to remind us that we did get some really good things done here, especially when it came to democracy. So that index that I mentioned that ranks all 50 states, and Virginia moved from 49th in the nation for ease of voting to 12th in the nation, all because of those voting changes that we were able to pass in the 2020 General Assembly session. So no excuse absentee voting, 45-day early voting period, getting rid of photo ID requirements, like all of those things. And you know what, we're not done yet. So I'll say, like, we are not done yet. And that goes back to what Delegate Price just mentioned. Like, we are about to start a legislative session tomorrow. And there's a lot more work that we have to do. Tomorrow, first day of session, day one bill, look at HB 1888 for folks that are tracking and following legislation here in Virginia. That is, we're calling it the Omnibus Election Administration Bill. So all of the changes that we need to make more permanent in Virginia when it comes to, allowing voters to fix any issue that with their absentee ballot they mail back, like they forgot to sign something, they forgot to date it, they'll have an opportunity to fix it. That's the curing process. We're going to make drop boxes more permanent, actually permanent in Virginia instead of, temporary because of COVID-19 and voting in the pandemic. We're going to, make pre-processing of these mailed ballots a requirement versus, just you can do it if you want, right? And that just makes it a lot easier for us to understand these election results and a lot easier on our election officials. So that's going to be heard tomorrow afternoon at around 4 o'clock. So tune in. You can see the House Privileges and Elections Committee discuss that and take a vote. That's a big one. It was mentioned earlier about a constitutional amendment on the right to vote. It is something that we have been in the trenches with Judith and the Advancement Project for 13 years now, right? It's been a long, long time. But we believe fundamentally that every eligible citizen should have their right to vote, and it should not be taken away because you've made a mistake. So we've been working on rights restoration and on this right to vote for over a decade, and we have an opportunity to finally see it through. And we're excited to work with a number of advocates and grassroots partners and legislators to see that happen. And then finally, the Voting Rights Act, which Marcia and Judith also mentioned. There's a federal Voting Rights Act, and then there's been a push lately to have states also take a look at where the gaps are and what states can do. Judith mentioned some of the issues that arise around moving polling places. And that's a big deal, right? And it used to be, before Shelby v. Holder, that we could see which localities were considering moving a polling place and what impact it would have on voters before that change actually happened. Reducing polling place hours, right? Like that's a big deal, right? If you eliminate all Saturday voting, that really has an impact on workers, right? On working folks who can't take time off on a Tuesday to cast a ballot, or on any weekday, frankly, because we have in-person early voting. So these are all things that we're hoping to capture in terms of, hey, before you make a voting change in your locality, let's actually take a look at this. Like, let's give an opportunity for public comment, for public notice, and for folks to weigh in to see if there's a disparate impact. Or, let's have a civil rights division in the Attorney General's office take a look at this and make sure that things are okay before we make that change. And I think this is really critical because we need to make sure that we are not disenfranchising voters, even if it's just a seemingly on its surface a technical change, right? All of those technical changes can have an effect on people's ability to cast a ballot. And I think that's why it's super important. The other pieces of what is in the Voting Rights Act that Delegate Price and Delegate Aird are introducing, along with a couple of other chief co-patrons. We talk about local elections and whether or not, people can really particularly communities of color and minority communities, can really have an opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice. And when you have these at-large districts, it oftentimes can marginalize communities of color. And Washington State passed a version of this in 2018. And it's something that, you know, we are very hopeful that we can do here in Virginia too, to make sure that there's representation, and fair representation at that, at all levels of our government, not only, you know, federal and state, but we're talking about local government too, where so many decisions are made that affect our lives on a daily basis. So there's a lot, like usually these P&E committee meetings happen like very, very quickly. Like I said, the first one's already happening tomorrow afternoon, first day of session. Usually like, I'm like, oh, first day of session is the first day back at school, where you just kind of wave and say hi to people. Like, you know, hey, it's good to be back. That's not what's happening here, y'all. So we need all hands on deck. I think everything is gonna move pretty quickly in both the House and the Senate. And if you care about these issues, I encourage you to weigh in. I think Delegate Price is gonna send an email with some summaries of key bills and bill patrons and ways that you all can engage. And the good news is that most of our session is virtual this year, which means that you all don't have to travel to Richmond. You don't have to take a day off. You can sign up to speak virtually and testify and tell your stories in committee meetings. And I do think that there will be plenty of opportunity for citizen engagement. So I hope folks will really weigh in on these heavy issues, because they're so critical. So thank you, Delegate Price.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tram. And as mentioned, we have been joined by Delegate LaSharice Aird of the 63rd District based in Petersburg, my seatmate, my sister in good trouble. And so we want her to introduce herself and then also talk about why was it so important for her to work on an issue like voting rights. So Delegate Aird.
Thank you so much, Delegate Price. Again, my sister in service. First and foremost, I just have to thank Delegate Price for her leadership, not just on the legislation that you've been hearing about tonight, but ultimately for her constant voice and constant commitment to election issues and protecting voting rights in a multitude of ways. You know, since she got elected, this has been something she has prioritized and has been fighting left and right to get us to where we are today. And so I just want to publicly thank her for her leadership on these issues. You know, I am very much like Tram in that when I was listening to Judith and Marcia, I thought, well, there it is, you know, snapping my fingers. There's nothing more to say, because what they said was so powerful. And so the only thing that I will really add to this conversation, because Tram has given you logistics, she has given you the bills that will be carried during this session, I will just talk about why I need each and every person that is observing tonight. I need you to care about your voting rights like you care about your money. Right? Like you pay close attention to every dollar you bring in, how you spend it, where it's going, and your voting rights, I promise you, are just as important, because your ability to vote, your ability to voice your opinion, that directly impacts your money. That directly impacts your livelihood. That directly impacts your community. As someone who represents a very diverse district, a rural, suburban, and urban district, I can tell you that the needs that we have here, they are intrinsically linked to my people's ability to get out and vote and to express by way of voting their voices on those issues that are important to them. And so for me, this issue is personal. This issue is personal to the people that I represent. And it needs to be something that is seamless. It needs to be easy because there are so many challenges, especially as a result of this pandemic, that everyday people are dealing with. And being able to vote does not need to be another one of those issues. This is something that since the beginning of time, we have been fighting for over and over, year after year. And I'm just so proud, again, to join Delegate Price in this fight to make sure that this is going to be one less issue that Virginians have to be concerned about, and that we put them in a position to be empowered more than ever before. And so I just want to thank Delegate Price for her leadership and the opportunity to partner with her because this is just critical in the lives of so many people, all of us.
And thank you, Delegate Aird. You all will see quite a few bills and topics that Delegate Aird and I will continue to partner on. And yes, we will be continuing our At Ease with Sia and LaSharice, and our first one will be tomorrow. More details on that, follow us on social media. But it is extremely important to have friends in movements, especially when I don't think Delegate Aird or I have found an easy bill that we can just work on. We're going after the tough topics, and it's being able to work with like-minded people. When you're not competing, you're collaborating in order to get things done for the people. So I appreciate you too, Delegate Aird. And so just to kind of, close it out, just an hour on voting rights is just not enough. So period, right? But I did want to let some folks know, because I get private messages a lot of like, I want to get involved. How do I get involved? Well, I worked with the NAACP, This Is My Vote campaign in 2012. I worked with the Virginia Liaison Office under, Governor Warner. Like, I was working in policy areas. I've been working in organizing areas far before, I became a delegate. And so there are many organizations that you can become a member of. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. But I've also just dropped a link in the chat about how you can follow along with session, and you can, look for those bills. The main bill that we're talking about for the Voting Rights Act of Virginia is House Bill 1890. So you can follow that along. I would love, if you support this bill, I would love for you to give public comment about what it does and how it would help you if you have lived experience of being disenfranchised. But then the other voting bills that are coming before us as well, as we mentioned, there will be quite a few. So one thing I forgot to mention was that I am the new Vice Chair for the Privileges and Elections Committee, and I'm also the chair of the Voting Rights Subcommittee. And so this is very serious, and we are going to do some work. Whether we have 30 days or more, we have time to get this bill passed. And so if you'll pay attention and contact your delegate and senator, if I'm not your delegate, but yeah, so like has been said, I just wanted to just reiterate, there's a lot of hope for someone like me coming later this month. And I think one of the American tragedies is that the Voting Rights Act was not reauthorized while Representative John Lewis was still alive. But I do know that they have put his name on the reauthorization bill, and with a Democratic trifecta, it is a priority on the federal level. But that doesn't mean that we can't do work here on the state level, especially since we are unclear as to how this current United States Supreme Court feels about some of the issues that they have not ruled on yet. And so it's imperative that we here on the state level are protecting ourselves. And so again, the Voting Rights Act of Virginia, it requires that changes that were spoken about to local laws and regulations be advertised in advance for public comment, and those have typically disenfranchised Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. It also expands the requirements for localities to provide voting materials in languages other than English for those localities that meet a certain threshold. It ensures fair representation in local government. As Tram was talking about local government, I'm thinking about, here in Newport News, as soon as the city council says that they want to do something, it's almost immediate that it goes into action. So we're talking about immediate changes that affect your life. Shout out to my mayor, McKinley Price, who is here on this call this evening and learning more about voting rights, but a staunch advocate for voting rights as well. It also strengthens protections against voter threats and intimidation to ensure that every voter can make their voice heard safely. So we had a press release that we dropped today that I'm about to put that link in there. But now I'm going to turn it over to Tempest, and Tempest is going to give us some of the questions, and then we can just kind of discuss it amongst ourselves, whoever wants to jump in. But we want to make sure that we get to your questions now.
Great. So we have a question from Tanya on Facebook. She said, what is the best way to get involved in this upcoming session?
Yeah, so Tanya, thank you for that. We will drop the link. We dropped it a little bit earlier. It says follow up. So last week, I don't know the days. Last week? Yeah, last week we had a session about how to engage during session, and I forgot to record it. So Tempest and I went back through and we reacted it out, and it goes through how to make public comment. You can either submit something in writing that you support or oppose a bill, or you can actually show up in the Zoom like this and give public live testimony. Just a reminder, anything that you put in that is public, so you don't want to put your private information in there. You can send emails to legislators. You can utilize Facebook, Twitter, Instagram to get the word out. But just make sure that you're being strategic as well, because say, for instance, if your delegate is not on the Privileges and Elections subcommittee that's dealing with the bill, you want to talk to that subcommittee first, because those votes happen at the subcommittee level, then the committee level, and then the full House. So you want to be strategic about your communications to make sure those first few votes go through. Tram, did you have anything else to add about how you're telling your folks to engage in session?
No, I think that covers it. And, you know, this is our first full regular virtual session. So I think I would just encourage folks to kind of bear with us. There may not be, and things are moving at a rapid pace. So, you know, in addition to just trying to speak publicly at some of these committee meetings, we're just also just making sure that we're emailing positions and encouraging folks. Because I think some of the legislative staff are in different geographic locations, like physically from their legislators. And so we're all just gonna learn, I think, this year. But every avenue you have to connect and communicate with your senator or your House member, like, do it, utilize it, because they need to hear from us. That's the only way we get things done.
Can I just make a general point about this? You know, our participation in democracy doesn't end on election day, right? And so it's really important, even when you have a wonderful elected official like Delegate Price, it is still important to weigh in because number one, she needs to know that you're with her when she's out there. She needs to know when you disagree. But the other members of the state legislature also need to know where the constituents and the voters of the state of Virginia, where they stand on issues. So always engage. Over engaging is probably better. I know Delegate Price might not like that idea, but the more that you can weigh in, the better. So that also from those of us who are lawyers, we, you know, when we have to end up suing sometimes over legislation, we look back to like what they call the legislative record and history to see what the debate was about. And so it's really very important that you weigh in.
All right, so we have quite a few questions about automatic restoration of rights. The first question is specifically about Senator Locke's proposed constitutional amendment, which will restore the rights for informally incarcerated people. In your opinion, what is the most effective way for constituents to pressure their legislators to support this bill? How can advocacy groups best channel their efforts?
Yeah, so as a legislator, I know that for every legislator that exists, there's a different answer to that question. So for me, pressure exists in, we've been talking all year. I know where you stand. I know how the bill impacts the lived experiences of those that I represent, or you have expressed to me unintended consequences. But this issue has been out there for long enough that, you know, years and years worth of data are showing that people looked to see what was going on in other states like Florida. This issue to allow more people to vote, especially with the automatic restoration of votes, it polls high. Like, people want people to have the second chance to be able to vote. Where it gets a little tricky is when you start talking about whether incarcerated people should have the right to vote. And so you have one camp that will say, If a right exists, it can't be taken away, you know, that sort of deal. Or the fact that, you know, if the crime wasn't voter fraud, then why are you losing your right to vote? And so that's one. And then the other is that automatic restoration is the way to go. However, I have supported I've supported both, basically, as Delegate Price. However you feel like it should be is what you should type up and put on public comment after you click on the link about how to engage and submit that. But then also reaching out to your legislator to let them know how you feel. But then again, being strategic. If your legislator is not carrying the bill or is not on that subcommittee in the House, then if it doesn't pass out the subcommittee, they will never get a chance to vote on it. You got to get to the folks that have that first crack at the apple, and that will be the Constitutional Amendment Subcommittee of Privileges and Elections in the House. Contact them to let them know which way you think it should be, like what you support, what you don't support, and then the full Privileges and Elections. And then once it passes out of committee, that's when it goes to the rest of the delegates, so you can start talking to your delegate if they're not on the subcommittee and committee. Phone calls are important. A lot of us are using both our district and our Richmond phone numbers. So if you dial it, it may be forwarded to somewhere else, but we're answering the phones. And then also, I think least effective for me, like you adding me on Twitter, but I've never met you and I don't even know if you live in my district, it doesn't give me the same amount of pressure. I read it and I, you know, acknowledge it, but I really want to have a conversation. Like, why is it important to you? Don't just tell me vote yes, why? And so there are a lot of folks that have been previously incarcerated that have reached out. There are folks that are incarcerated that are reaching out. There are mothers and you know, siblings of folks that are incarcerated or have been previously incarcerated that have reached out. And I have that bank of lived experiences as to how automatic voter restoration would help them. And that is very helpful when I am going forward to vote on that bill. So share your story. Tell us what you want. Don't beat around it. Either vote yes, vote no on the specific bill. But that I think is what works, at least for me. But you got to get to know your legislator if I'm not your legislator.
All right, so I'm going to kind of combine two questions since we're a little pressed for time. Where can participants go to view all of the proposed bills for the legislative session? And then we had someone ask, what are the plans for the General Assembly to address expungement bills?
Okay, so I am dropping this link right now. This is for all of the bills that have been put in for the 2021 session. Number one question I get is, why does it start with House Bill 1735? That's because last year we started at House Bill 1, and this year is a continuation of that. But you can scroll all the way through. Please understand that the bills do not have to be filed until our deadline tomorrow. So you might want to check this tomorrow afternoon, and then you'll have about 99% of the bills that will be filed. And then you can look up and see what the expungement bills are. I do know that Senator Scott Surville and Majority Leader Charnel Herring have been working on the expungement issue, and it's an issue that came before the Barrier Crimes Committee that I vice chair as well. And we're just going to try and make sure that whichever way we take, automatic restoration, sealing of records is also aligned with the barrier crimes that we're trying to remove and how all of that works together. But we are trying to make progress in 2021 about expungement. And also understand that for me, expungement is a huge part of the legalization conversation and is basically a non-starter if we're not having the reparative and restorative, as I've learned, parts of those bills as well. So thank you to the advocates for new language around that, but just we're gonna make it right before we make it legal. So that's the bottom line on that.
Do you expect the Virginia Redistricting Commission to strengthen voting rights and make every vote count?
So if I understand the question correctly, the Redistricting Commission is just drawing maps. They don't do legislation other than the bills that the maps will become. So the actual strengthening of voting rights to get to make sure everybody's vote counts, I think is more the legislation that we discussed, like the elections bill and the voting rights bills that will be coming before the Privileges and Elections Committee. But redistricting and how fairly a map is directly impacts someone's ability to be represented. So, if Judith, you or Marcia want to jump in on the link between redistricting and voting rights, but just not the commission itself, but yes, those two issues are well linked.
Yeah, I would start by saying that basically with redistricting, we are looking at how districts are going to be drawn in a way that allows people to be able to elect their candidates of choice. And everyone needs to be engaged in that process, just as they are with voting, to make sure that their voices are heard about what they want their districts to look like, and to ensure that, their interests are being represented and protected. Whatever form, whoever is drawing the maps, your voice still needs to be involved in that conversation, and you still need to make clear. And as Judith mentioned, with the legislature and building the record, we also need to build a record in the redistricting process. Because if after you've engaged and you don't get the districts that allow opportunity to elect candidate of choice, as Judith mentioned, that's where we come in, and that's where the courts come in. And our cases are only as strong as the record that you build. And knowing what voters want in a district is really important in ensuring that we protect those rights and interests.
And the last question that I have is, can we require that those who run for office can only do so after they prove that they know the Constitution?
So that's funny. It's also not funny because it's needed, and we've seen that on the national stage. I don't know that there is legislation being drafted or dropped for this session for that. I think I'm almost sure that there's not, but it does bring to the point what happens before an elected official is elected. So for instance, the more you know, the less tricks a candidate can play on you as they're lying about the Constitution or whatever, the less they can overpromise. A lot of folks that are running for office, they're promising the world. I'm like, honey, that is not in your jurisdiction. That's a whole nother elected official's duty. But I think the more that we know, the more we emphasize civics education, the more that we can define these terms and know for ourselves, the more power we will have as we're going to the ballot box to choose our elected officials. So it'll be less on personality or demagoguery, but actually on those people that are trying to make the changes in the community. Do you all have anything to add to that? Okay, no, but good question. We should at least know what we're talking about for the position that we're running for, and the Constitution does indeed drive us there. So we are a little bit over time. I just want to thank you all so much. Thank you, Tempest. To thank you to Marcia and Judith and Tram and Delegate Aird that were all here. And I did say that if you registered and attended, you were going to be put in a drawing. So I came off camera. So Virginia is now hands-free if you are driving and have a mobile device. And so Doris Bay, Khadija Sellers, Roosevelt Charles, and Amber Brown. If you did not put your address in the registration, we'll contact you to get your addresses so that we can send you a hands-free device to promote being hands-free. So thank you for attending. But seriously, thank you to everyone that attended. Again, we just barely scratched the surface. These are like semester-long courses that folks take on, voting rights. But thank you for being here tonight. Now, you all know, if you've ever come to one of my things, that now means that we have started a conversation. So I expect you to reach out. I expect you to do the public comment. I also expect you to ask your questions that you may not have felt comfortable asking tonight or didn't know you had tonight. And our email is still open. So thank you so much for coming this evening. Thank you again to our awesome panelists. And lastly, it's an upbeat note, but it's just an acknowledgement that in these political times, when you're fighting for the rights of those that have been historically disenfranchised, it's not safe. It's not easy. And so uplifting the women of color that were on this call tonight and praying for protection and safety for all of the work that we are doing, because it matters, and we will keep going. So thank you so much for that. We appreciate your support this evening, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.